For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. On the talking point, we're looking at the Biden-Kishida online meeting and whether constraining China is working. Experts today, Tomohiko Taniguchi is a former special advisor to ex-Japan Prime Minister Shinzō Abe's cabinet. He's currently a professor of international political economy and Japan strategic diplomacy at Keio University. Professor Taniguchi, good to see you again. Good evening.
Good to see you again. Thank you very much for having me again.
Professor Taniguchi is in Tokyo, and joining us all the way from Washington, D.C. on another continent is Robert M. Manning. He's a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. He's been a former U.S. National Intelligence Council, I beg your pardon, and State Department official. Mr. Manning, thank you. Good morning to you.
Thank you. Thanks. And also thanks for having me as well.
Pleasure's all ours. Professor, in your assessment, now it's been a few months, how much has Prime Minister Kishida actually furthered Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's vision to push back against China's aggression?
Well, nothing much is the shortest answer, because he has had to focus his attention entirely on how to tackle COVID-19, the Omicron variant, and so on. So this is going to be a very much important opportunity for Mr. Kishida to show that his commitment is as strong as his predecessors in front of the world eyes, especially those from China and other parts of the world. And Mr. Kishida must also show that he is well versed on international affairs, because Russia-Ukraine situation is going to be one that Biden and Kishida will have to look at.
Sure. Just taking off from that point, Mr. Manning, how distracted is the Biden administration with I mean, they will be talking about that, but is he being able to concentrate on the Indo-Pacific, the focus that his administration wants?
That's the problem. You can have any strategy you want, but at the end of the day, it's events that dictate where you pay attention. And I think that Putin knows this. I think Biden has not handled it very well. His press conference on Wednesday was a disaster, talking about minor incursions. Imagine what that sounded like in Taiwan, for example. And, even our Ukrainian friends, President Zelensky really lashed out at him for that. So I think they're in a damage control mode. And I think Putin probably will act sometime in coming weeks. I'm of the view that he probably won't do a full invasion and occupation, but maybe something that some people might consider a minor occasion, breaking off Russian-speaking provinces, that sort of thing. But I'd be surprised. I'd be surprised if there was a diplomatic solution where Russian troops packed up and went home.
Right, Professor Taniguchi, one of our regular viewers, Omkar Datwe, says looking forward to the Quad Summit in Japan. I'm not sure whether the date has been announced and what the Omicron situation will be. But Japan's defense budget, Professor, I mean, we've spoken on a different program on StratNews Global with you on that as well. Record defense budget, supplementary defense, increase in defense spending. Is Japan buying the right platforms that it needs to deter China?
I think that's very much a timely question, Amitabh. Certainly, Japan and the United States are very much keen on developing the sixth generation fighter aircraft, but that's going to be a manned version. But the killer platform that is emerging is everything, let's say, autonomous and unmanned. So the challenge is that Japan and the United States are faced with are dire. Because of that, it is increasingly important for those like-minded countries such as Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, and other countries such as the UK to join knowledge forces to get better prepared for countries such as China that do not necessarily have much vested interests as older countries like the United States or Japan have.
Right. Mr. Manning, I mean, we've seen these reports that have been coming out of late. This is relating to specific signals that the U.S. is sending with the USS, the United States nuclear powered submarine Nevada, which docked in Guam, I think it was about a week ago. Reports say those vessels can launch over 150 Tomahawk cruise missiles in less than 6 minutes. The fact that it docked, the fact that you saw it on the surface and pictures were released, those kind of signals, how do you see them going down with China?
Well, I think what a lot of the U.S. and the U.S.-Japan alliance is doing is trying to put in place an anti-access denial capability. And for example, Japan building up on all its southern islands and so on. And I think the U.S., and since the U.S. doesn't have a lot of short and medium range missiles and the Chinese have hundreds of them, I think, demonstrating that capability by sending a submarine to Guam is intended to send a message to China.
Professor Taniguchi, if you want to take that, and there's another question for you from 1 to 4, just madness, Professor. How does Japan view events in the US, and how will it impact its relationship with Russia, where it has, with whom it has island disputes, of course?
Well, what kind of events that the questioner is talking about is something that I have to guess. But certainly, the United States is going into its hectic political season, and so is South Korea, for instance. And there are many, many countries that have to undergo hectic political calendars. And I think that's to be seen by dictators such as Xi Jinping and Putin and Kim Jong Un as opportunities. So stability and continuity, consistency, easy to be said, but those are the values that Kishida, Biden, all other leaders of the democratic countries must pay great attention to, so that weakness should not be projected to those to those dictators, because weakness, any sign of weakness, should invite more provocations.
On that line, Professor, I mean, both Prime Minister Kishida and, I think, the Defense Minister have begun to link Taiwan's security with Japan, which would, possibly enable Japan to play a role in Taiwan's defense. Your comments on that, Professor?
Right. It dates back to the previous administration of Prime Minister Suga's. Prime Minister Suga was invited by President Biden, as Mr. Biden's first in-person meeting in Washington, D.C. And over that bilateral meeting came out this pledge between the United States and Japan that the Taiwan Strait issue must be resolved in peaceful ways. So that was the first time ever that the joint statement touched upon T issue, the Taiwan issue. And that trend has gone on without any disruptions. And I think the statement to be given by the bilateral discussion between Biden and Kishida, I'm sure is going to also include something about Taiwan.
Mr. Manning, your comments on how Taiwan is center stage, and
how I would agree. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And also the fact of, China and Taiwan, Russia and Ukraine. Can the U.S. actually face a two-front war, two wars? I mean, allies are already partners, very skeptical about the U.S. as a superpower.
Well, first of all, Biden has from the beginning ruled out U.S. troops for Ukraine. So the response is just a question of how severe sanctions are. They're talking about removing SWIFT from Russian banks and so on. But that is a problem because a lot of our policies are pushing China and Russia closer together, and how far that goes, we don't know. I think they have inherent limits, but suppose they coordinate attacks on Ukraine and Taiwan. I don't know. I think that would be extremely problematic for the United States to deal with. And on Taiwan, I think there's as part of the kind of anti-China consensus in Washington, that everybody is falling over themselves, to say how much we love Taiwan, and which is that's fine, but you have to understand that China, it accelerates Chinese aggressiveness in response, and I think when a major senior U.S. defense official talks about Taiwan as a strategic asset, the Chinese start to wonder, do the three communiques in the Taiwan Relations Act still govern the bilateral relationship? So that could make for cross singles.
Mm-hmm. Professor Taniguchi, your comments on that, and another viewer, let me just put that up. Manivanam Chokilangam says, why can't an AUKUS-like deal be offered to Japan and South Korea?
AUKUS deal. Let me just address the Taiwan issue first.
Sure.
Because Xi Jinping has made it clear a number of times. In effect, without Taiwan entering into Chinese sovereignty, the so-called China's dream is not going to be complete. The time frame Xi Jinping, I think, is looking at is within the next 27 years, because 2049 will be the year of centenary since the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Xi Jinping is going to escalate the country's efforts on bringing Taiwan back into China's possession. So Taiwan issue is not going to be lighter. It's going to be weightier still. And that's something that no one should misunderstand. United States and Japan must get prepared. However, if you push the envelope too fast and too far, exactly as Mr. Manning mentioned, Xi Jinping is going to find it as a useful, window of opportunity. So Japan, especially with its great economic stake that it has on Chinese soil, has to walk a very much tight rope, always in close consultation with Washington, D.C. and others. Asia, I think if you look at South Korea, the next administration to be chosen by the election is going to have to cut its own strategy vis-a-vis China. And very, very few people, either in Washington, D.C. or in Tokyo, Canberra, can see what sort of strategy South Korea is going to have. So far, it's been virtually impossible for South Korea to stay on the same wavelength with the United States and Japan or Australia about such issues as East China Sea or South China Sea. Their focus has been almost entirely over land, not overseas. I do hope that that sort of perspective is going to change with the introduction of the new administration, but we will see.
Mr. Banning, the same question to you. I know you are, how should I put it, a bit realistic about AUKUS, but should AUKUS or can AUKUS be...
Yeah, well, I think I think in some ways it's stealthily happening in terms of, if you look at the technology cooperation between Japan and Australia, for example, it's kind of an auxiliary already. In the case of South Korea, I think if you look at South Korean defense spending, they are trying to develop a more nationalist, a more autonomous capability. And I think one impact of AUKUS will be the Koreans pushing the U.S. much harder for them to have nuclear submarines. They have sophisticated nuclear industry, nuclear power, and so on. And so this is an issue that they've been angling for a back end of the fuel cycle for many years, and the AUKUS deal with another American ally is going to accelerate that tendency. And although it's still not clear, I think it really depends on who wins the March elections. If Moon's party wins, I think you're going to see more continuity. If the conservatives win, I think you're going to see a much tougher position. And we just have to wait and see what happens. What's the impact of all these North Korean missile tests on South Korean public opinion? We don't know yet.
Professor Taniguchi, another question from you from Omkar Datpe. Why is the Republic of Korea and Japan, despite being the closest allies of the U.S., why haven't they been able to build trust and resolve the historical disputes? Wouldn't this hamper the efforts of containing China and North Korea?
Clearly, the row between the two countries hampers, not benefits. And I agree that. But however, Japanese self-defense forces, it's a maritime self-defense force, boats and vessels all carry their naval ensigns. But naval ensigns that the Japanese self-defense forces have used for decades has been viewed as a sign of evil for the South Koreans, which actually in effect prohibits Japanese maritime self-defense force boats from entering South Korean ports. And if this being the case, it's very much difficult for Tokyo and Seoul to further defense collaborations. And I would urge the South Koreans to be level-headed, calm, and see the reality that Japanese self-defense forces have done no harm at all against South Korea.
Right. Ayush Kumar has one for you, Professor Manning. It's quoting a foreign policy article which says that the U.S. is an overstretched power, retreat from Afghanistan, a quote-unquote minor incursion in Eastern Europe, and being non-committal on Taiwan. He wants your views, though you have mentioned them before, Mr. Manning.
Thank you. Well, I think that there's some truth to that. I think the U.S. Has really not come to terms with an increasingly multipolar world, and there's a lot of hangover from the, unipolar mentality of the early '90s, and that contributes to a kind of lack of realism amongst foreign policy thinking. I think that getting out of Afghanistan could be seen as a plus for Asia policy, because Biden has made a conscious effort to reduce our profile in the Middle East because they see the strategic imperatives in the Indo-Pacific. The way they did it, the terrible planning, really obscured that reality, and I think it raised questions about competence, which Biden was supposed to be. That was supposed to be what differentiated Biden from Trump. But now people are wondering about that to some extent. And, the thing about Ukraine is, we have no commitment to defend them. I think the fact that Russia is pushing so hard has mobilized NATO to do more than it probably would have otherwise wanted to do. And on Taiwan, I think the U.S. has been very successful with our approach of strategic ambiguity. which is essentially an effort to commit ourselves to peaceful reunification and try to inhibit both sides from taking unilateral action, either on the Taiwan side from declaring independence or China from taking military action. It's worked very well. Some people now wonder if it's outdated or not. I'm not of that school because when I was in government working for George W. Bush, there was enormous tension between the U.S. and Taiwan at the first DPP government, doing a lot of ambitious things that Bush felt were getting in the way of his Middle East wars. So there's a lot of tension. So I think there's in American thinking that's still there. On South Korea, the sad thing is in the past, there's always going to be this historical, emotional attitude on both sides, especially in South Korea. But in the past, the military, the defense relationship was compartmentalized, and I think sadly it's become part of the larger equation. And the only beneficiary of that, as far as I can see, is China. It doesn't benefit either Japanese or Korean people at all. And that's why the U.S. has been pushing very hard for accelerating trilateral defense cooperation, because that's going to be critical.
Mm-hmm. Both of you making that point. Professor Taniguchi, we've spoken about this earlier, but you can't but commend and the former Prime Minister Abe Shinzō for his confluence of Xi's speech to the joint session of Parliament in India way back in 2007, where he foresaw everything that was happening. But in terms of bilateral, multilateral, plurilateral, whether it's the Quad, whether there are other countries, Professor Taniguchi, India, Japan, you are an advocate of much closer cooperation. Professor?
Certainly, I am one of those strongest advocates, but Amitabh, it's bipartisan agenda, and it's unanimous agreement, if you like, across the board in Japan of the need of greater cooperation, collaboration between India and Japan on all aspects, from military to technology or space development. And indeed, India and Japan are on course of developing their moon exploration project, which is exciting. So I think on this aspect, may I just say the sky is the only limit, to use the metaphor, between Japan and India.
Sure. Mr. Manning, Sai Prasad has a question for you. How does the U.S. see India strategically as an Indo-Pacific power to counter China?
Well, I think there are differing views, but I think the U.S. sees India as a very important part of the picture, and I think that's why we've pushed on moving the Quad forward. I think there's a need to give more thought about what the Quad should or shouldn't do and how to build on the cooperation that we have. I think unfortunately in the U.S., I think there's a lack of understanding about India as being strategically autonomous. That's part of India's political and defense culture. And so this idea of, treating them more like an ally, I think there could create tension between the U.S. and India. And so I think we have a defense cooperation, the defense relationship has moved ahead dramatically. Excuse me. And I think what's missing is building the economic component of that relationship. That needs to be much stronger if it's going to be successful.
Mm-hmm. This summit, even if it's virtual, Professor, comes on the back of what the NSA spoke as a preview, Japan and U.S. There's a 2+2 that happened this month, and it also followed what happened between Japan and Australia in terms of the Reciprocal Access Agreement. How important are all those strands, Professor?
If you look at what's going on in the Indo-Pacific region, countries such as Japan are playing a pivotal role in multiplying the effects and usefulness of alliance networks or networks of coalition, coalition of the willing countries. Australia, Japan have enhanced their defense ties, and 2+2 meetings that you just mentioned, Amitabh, between Japan and the United States involved one of the newly appointed members of the Kishida cabinet, Mr. Hayashi, who prior to that had been viewed somehow softer toward China. But Mr. Hayashi and Mr. Kishi, defense minister, and their counterparts from the United States have used, I would say, even tougher languages when describing Taiwan, China, and they mentioned ultrasonic, for instance, indicating that the United States and Japan must work harder to develop the 21st century cutting edge technologies. So, yes, that's what's happening. And may I just mention also that Indo-Pacific strategy has been embraced by ASEAN, by EU, and the UK, France, the Netherlands, and so on. So last year, 2021, has been a momentous year in that respect, with the dispatch of the UK's newly commissioned carrier strike group over to the Indo-Pacific theater, including Japan. And that was accompanied by the Dutch and German forces. France and Japan also are engaged in intensive 2+2 dialogues, focusing mostly on the defense cooperation. So time has flown, and here we are.
Time has flown, Mr. Manning, but how do you see the Russia-China dynamic in the region?
I think Russia has a different set of interests, and at the end of the day, don't forget the Chinese still have territorial claims on the Russian Far East, which I'm sure is in the back of Russian minds. They're always historically wary of China. I think so. I think, but to some extent, as we've pushed them together, they have combined the military exercises and so on, doing things. Russia's doing things in East Asia that they would have not done 5 or 10 years ago. I think it reinforces the U.S. Japan alliance in terms of having to deal with both of them. And I think we saw that in the 2+2 meeting. There were some real subtle advances in jointness in terms of operations, planning, intelligence, and defense industrial technology cooperation.
Right. I just wanted to get your views, Professor Manning, on Russia and China, especially in light of latest reports where India and Russia are very close to signing on the dotted line for the BrahMos supersonic missile to be given to coast batteries. I just wanted to get Professor Taniguchi to speak on that.
Right. It's India has its own diplomatic strategy, but at the end of the day, India has its identity as a long-standing democracy, parliamentary democracy, and that is the value that Japan cherishes, and that is the value that has actually multiplied the soft power that India can exert upon and can use. And so I think Narendra Modi is very much careful and tactful in cutting India's strategy going forward. But I think Narendra Modi always will come back to the core value that I mentioned.
Professor Manning, just a question for you from Sachin. What does the U.S. have to offer India in order to get India on its side? That is, why should India join or support the U.S. against Russia or any other world power. He's put China in that bracket as well. And CAATSA comes to mind, Mr. Manning.
Well, as I said, I think India has always been and probably will always be a strategic autonomous actor. And that occasionally creates irritants because, as I said, Americans have tended to have unrealistic expectations that India would somehow gravitate into the U.S. Orbit more than they have. There is a very large overlap of interest based on both values and interests. And I think that will continue. But I think India makes decisions on what they think best advances their interests. And if that they've had a long history of defense weaponry and technology bought from Russia, and I think that's continuing. And that will be something of an irritant. There's a push in the U.S. to exempt potential sanctions and so on. But that's always going to be an issue.
Mm-hmm. Right. Professor Taniguchi, one last question. I think I saw a joint statement between Japan and US on the NPT. Parth, who has a comment, Japan needs to go nuclear ASAP. You were talking about AUKUS earlier. Will Japan ever go in for nuclear powered submarines? I mean, nuclear arms is completely out of the question, right, Professor?
China is not hiding its intention anymore that there might be an opportunity for them to strike first with its nuclear arsenal on Japan, especially targeting at U.S. bases in Japan. This has become lousier. This has become an even more lousy neighborhood. And I think I am one of those people, a minority group of people who advocates that Japan should consider very much seriously of having its own nuclear capabilities jointly with the United States, something akin to what West Germany had during the Cold War, the dual key system with the United States. But I remain one of those very limited number of people. Kishida is a unique case. He is from Hiroshima, and his signature policy has always been banning nuclear weapons. The statement that you mentioned, Amitabh, the NPT statement issued jointly by the United States and Japan, mentioned something very much interesting that the United States and Japan should call upon world leaders and young people to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki to learn the menace of nuclear war. And I think that's something that I would imagine Kishida wanted to see included in the statement. So the short answer to your question is not in the immediate future, but in the medium to long range. One must be better prepared for that possibility that Japan needs to have nuclear capabilities, either for submarines or for intermediate range missiles with the help and cooperation from the United States.
Mr. Manning, final comments. So much has changed. Do you think it could change that much for Japan to go nuclear, whether powered or armed?
I wouldn't totally rule it out if you're looking out 10 or 15 years. It depends really where things go with China and the credibility of U.S. deterrence. Don't forget, on China, if Japan could be considered a virtual nuclear power already. It has a developed nuclear industry, has full fuel cycle, and it wouldn't be that hard if Japan decided to go nuclear to achieve that in a fairly short period of time. So I think it's incumbent upon the U.S. to make sure that our alliance is solid, that our credibility of extended deterrence is sustained, because otherwise you're going to see a number of countries like Japan, possibly there's the big debate in South Korea about whether they should go nuclear, or even Taiwan. It wouldn't shock me if in the out years people started thinking about that.
Mr. Manning, absolutely appreciate your time early in the morning in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us again on StratNews Global, Mr. Manning.
My pleasure.
Pleasure's ours. And Professor Taniguchi, as usual, great having you on the program as well. Have a good night. I know it's very late in Tokyo.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
See you soon next time.
See both of you. Thank you. And all our viewers, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, do that. Do like this video and share the link with your personal and professional contacts. StratNews Global also has a link up if you would like to support us financially. I'm putting that up on the screen, and it's there in the YouTube description as well. This is Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.